Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each interview on this podcast begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life, YouTube celebrities, historians, to my next-door neighbor. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not-so-distant past. The jumping-off point is a place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery, fueled by an unrelenting need to know more. We look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode note. I'd like to take a moment to share with you what Digpod of Great Britain had to say about Armchair Historians. Just utterly delightful. This is such an understated, delicate, and downright delightful podcast. The subjects covered are engaging, and the rapport between host and guest elevates the whole listening experience. Take note of this one. That was Digpod's review left via Apple Podcasts. Wherever you listen to Armchair Historians, be sure to subscribe, like, and review wherever possible. I love living in this small town in the Colorado Rockies. Some of the things I love most include the historic landscape, being surrounded by breathtaking vistas, but most of all, the people. The people who live and visit here are some of the most interesting I've met in all my travels. My guest today is one such person. I met Ruth, a resident of the National Historic Landmark District in which I live, around 5 years ago, at a wine and cheese reception for the museum I was working for at the time. One of the first things we discussed was travel, a topic and experience we are both passionate about, and a topic which has preoccupied many of our conversations over the course of our friendship, which found footing in that first one. Over the years, I've learned that Ruth is a brilliant writer, that she's lived in 4 different countries, been to all but one continent, and has visited over 50 countries. Today, Ruth shares with us a more recent history about a natural disaster which directly affected her life. Ruth Rosenfeld, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm not sure exactly what you're going to talk about. I think it has something to do with Japan because I know how much you love that topic. So I'm going to we'll go off to the races and I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
This history is not old history. It's relatively modern. I lived in Japan for 3 years, and during the period that I lived there, around the time that I was ready to leave, there was the huge earthquake and tsunami.
Oh, yeah,
in 2011. So that's what I will be talking about today.
Okay, so that is very recent. It's history nonetheless. So this is going to be an amazing topic because you were there.
Yes. Let me talk about the disaster first, and then I can talk about where I was. Actually, I lived west of Tokyo, about a half an hour west of Tokyo. So I wasn't in the thick of everything, but I certainly was affected by it. So first there was the disaster, the 9.0 earthquake, which is stronger than anything that's been recorded in the last 100 years.
Wow.
And after that, that caused the tsunami. That led to the damage. They both led to the damage at Fukushima, which was the nuclear power plant, Fukushima Daiichi, that was affected. There was a lot of pieces to this. There was a fear afterwards that the whole nuclear power plant would blow, which I don't think was something that people could see internationally, but was very much felt by the people who were living there then. And then there's the effect that it had on my Japanese friends and their lives, even years later.
So you were living in Japan at the time.
Yes, I had kind of a change of life in my 50s. My husband died, my kids were gone, and I went and taught in 3 different countries for 8 years. And Japan was the last one. I was there for 3 years. And actually, I went back a few years later and did another semester. I was teaching at a university there. And I took off that semester. That was going to be my last few months in Japan. I had an apartment, and the lease was up in the middle of the summer. So I was planning to be there through the summer, and I did well enough. I had a little bit of savings that I just thought, not going to teach this last semester. I'm going to do a little traveling. I'm going to do some writing. I was in my teeny little Japanese apartment, sitting and typing on my computer, writing on my laptop.
Do you remember what you were typing at that moment?
I have been working on a book about my story living in the 3 countries. Yeah, I was working on my book, and I'm not sure what piece I was working on at the time. I had, those Japanese doors that have small panes, and usually you see them with paper.
Yeah.
But I had one in my apartment that had glass panes, and it would, pull from the living room and separate it from the entry. And at times it would kind of make a little noise if there was, and there were always mild earthquakes and there were storms and such, but it started rattling louder and stronger than I had ever had happened before. And I knew that this was an earthquake. And what you're told when you live in lands that have earthquakes is to stand in the doorway, in the door jamb, somewhere in your place that would be the strongest place that would be less likely to be affected. So I jumped up and stood in the door jamb of the bathroom, and behind me in the bathroom, the medicine cabinet opened and things were bouncing all over the place and banging. And I thought, uh-oh, and I could hardly, everything was shaking. It affects your vision and everything. So I took one big step into my living room and grabbed my laptop and purse and ran out the door. I was on the second floor, and I ran into the street, and there were a few neighbors around, and everybody was just standing there kind of in circles looking up, and the shaking went on for 5 minutes, and
Holy
that is not an exaggeration. You could feel the sidewalk rippling underneath your feet.
Wow.
And I was a little ways from the downtown area in the town that I lived in, and we could see the tall buildings go like this. And the Japanese are very careful about the structure of their buildings to withstand earthquakes. So nothing toppled or fell. But later on, we heard that there was a lot of damage inside because they were just,
Well, I could imagine if your apartment had the medicine cabinet throwing things out at you, that what was going on inside of other buildings.
Right.
So how
Right.
far were you from the epicenter?
I was actually 25 minutes west of Tokyo by train, and the epicenter was east off the coast of Sendai, which is a city that is northeast, a little north and on the coast. I was quite a distance away. So what happened was the earthquake came first, and the earthquake caused the tsunami. And the villages along that northeastern coast had just had this massive earthquake. People were trying to get out. The roads were damaged. Vehicles were damaged. Some people were looking for other family members. And basically, very few people had time to get out of town before the tsunami came. The tsunami was estimated at about 15 meters high, which is almost 50 feet.
Wow.
It's enormous. I was obsessively watching videos and things afterwards, and there was one where some people were on top of a building, and I don't know whether, I think it was the 4th floor, and they were videoing it, and it just kept coming. The water just kept coming, and you don't see it like waves. It just kind of floats in and just keeps coming and covered everything, and soon that building was the only thing sticking up. There were cars floating by and all kinds of things. One of the really interesting things that I read and heard was that some of those villages had a sign up the hill from the village that said, "Don't build past this point." And nobody knew what it meant. It was from so long ago that obviously there had been a tsunami of that magnitude at some point, and people who were alive at the time erected that to warn people, but nobody paid any attention. I think there was one village that survived because they had built up the hill from one of those signs. There's still a lot of people who are displaced and not going back to those villages because 19,000 people dead or unaccounted for. They never found the bodies. And then at the same time, the Fukushima power plant, the nuclear power plant, the Japanese government had thought that they should build these power plants in areas where they were somewhat depressed or poor. It would give people jobs. So it was not the best placement. It was close enough to the ocean to be affected by it. And initially there was damage to the power plant from the earthquake, and the cooling system went out. Then the tsunami came. So it was like a double whammy, and they never planned for that. I think if they had one or the other, they would have been able to compensate, but they had never planned for that magnitude of a disaster.
So you were able to go back into your flat?
Yes, I was able to go back. And at the time, I hung around with some Japanese friends at a jazz club. I had one friend who texted me with warnings, do this, do that, but wear a mask when you go outside. Because what happened was, initially at Fukushima, they would let off steam to try to reduce the pressure. There was meltdown. They were trying to reduce the pressure, and that stuff is going out in the air, and you're paying attention to which way the wind is going. Is it coming over this way,
How far were you from the power plant?
Oh, I was pretty far from the power plant, but it's all in the air. It's
Yeah, I know. So pretty far. What does that mean?
Well, I was west of Tokyo, and it was north of Tokyo. It would have been quite a few hours to travel up there. We were terrified that it would be carrying radiation over the city,
I couldn't even imagine. Were you kicking yourself for making the decision to stay?
No. In fact, I didn't even think about leaving initially. I had Japanese friends who encouraged me, and some of them said, I would leave if I could. Where can I go, But why stay here? We don't know what's going to happen. And I went to the jazz club, and I can remember sitting there, and there was an aftershock. There was a lot of aftershocks, and this one was pretty strong. And things were swaying. There were hanging lamps, and they were swaying. And everybody stood up, and everybody was trying to decide whether to run out again, and then it settled down. And people got on the phone, and they called somebody they knew. Somebody checked on their phone to see where the aftershock center was, and somebody called a friend there and to see if it was okay, if they were okay. It was just, we were all on pins and needles. There were people at the jazz club, friends of mine, who knew people who were telling stories about, one had elderly parents that lived in Iwate, which is one of the areas on the coast, but they lived up the hill. and they were okay, but they had no power, and they probably had no power for a long time. People were talking about it, people that they knew were affected in one way. There was somebody that somebody knew who worked at Fukushima, but happened to be off that week visiting their family someplace else. And then there was another guy who went back to work at Fukushima, and nobody had heard from him since. So people had to go in to this situation and try and stabilize it. So one of the things that happened was they shut down all the power plants. And Japan is an island, and they were quite dependent on nuclear power because they didn't have a lot of other sources. So they shut all the nuclear power plants down until they could
just to be safe.
Right. Yeah, and they set up a blackout schedule, and a friend's son called me to translate. They would be having trucks go through the streets with loudspeakers telling you what in your neighborhood, here's this, that, here are the rules. So I had some people to help me.
So you don't speak Japanese?
I speak some Japanese, but beginning conversations, where I live and I work and where I'm from. And then usually the people who, and I took some Japanese classes, but the people who are not older than me or younger have studied it in school, and their English is so much better. They can communicate and understand subtleties, and I'm like an idiot in Japanese,
So what were you teaching there then if you didn't speak
English?
You were teaching English.
Teaching English. It was an extracurricular program at a university. I taught at a women's university for 3 years, and then another university, a co-ed university that was a really good school in Tokyo for half a year when I went back the second time. But it was a conversation-based curriculum, so we would engage them in conversation and then try and get them talking to each other using the vocabulary and grammar that we were learning. It was great fun, and it's a good way to get to know people, is teaching conversational English.
Well, you are one of my most adventurous friends, I have to say that. And that the thought of that in a place so foreign to me, the thought of it is, I don't have the courage to do that. I'll go to England because they speak a version of English, but you're a brave soul is what I'm trying to say.
I enjoy learning about different cultures and meeting people, learning about their lives. And, when I first started out doing this, my first job was at an American school in Guatemala City. And, I pretty much hung out with the expats there. And little by little, I became more immersed in the different countries that I lived in and got to know people and didn't hang around with the Americans because you get yourself into a bubble.
Go and right. So how long were you there for?
I was in Japan for 3 years, and then I went back about 2 years later for another half a year semester. After
the earthquake.
Right. Actually, when the earthquake happened, a little while after, the following week, a good friend of mine who was the director of the school that I taught in Guatemala was there visiting her family because her daughter married a guy who was with an international company, and they were in Tokyo for a few years. And we had planned to get together, and her family left, and she had a flight on Thursday, and we talked earlier in the week, and she said, you have to make a plan. You have to make a plan. What are you going to do? And I ended up getting a flight for the same day so we could travel to the airport together. This happened March 11th, so that was a little bit further into March, and I went back to the States for a month, and then I had planned a trip in May anyway. So I went ahead and did that. I met my son, and we did China.
You went to China.
And then I went back to Japan and stayed until my lease was out. And I was glad to see my friends again and see if everything
So
was
you
okay.
went back to Japan. Okay, I'm trying to get the timeline here. So
So
you
about a
you
month and a
left.
half or so later, a couple of months later.
And how
And
long was your lease after that?
it was the middle of the summer.
So you stayed
So
there
I was
another
there for a
couple
couple of months.
months?
Yeah. And they still had the blackouts. And one of the things that really worried me was that just west of where Fukushima was the biggest farm belt where the vegetables came from. I was terrified to be buying fresh fruits and vegetables from that area. And my friends, my Japanese friends, had different points of view about it. One said, they're telling us it's okay, but they're lying. But the government would play down the risk from the power plant and how much radiation was in the air, and it's not enough to be harmful. People really didn't believe it. I had one friend who said, it's not an issue, but we have to be careful of the children because you could have more buildup through your life.
So did they
It was just
determine
terrifying.
that there was radiation in the air or?
Oh yeah, not where I was, but in that area. And it was all over the place. Those villages that were affected, that whole area was sealed off. There are a few people, I've seen videos of a few older people who lived there, and that was their home and their lives, and they decided to go back and take care of their animals. But there's almost nobody there. It's still very much affected. Pretty
Why did
scary.
you go back? Why did you decide to go back?
Well, the power plant didn't blow. I had my life there. I had my life there for years. I had my stuff there. I had my friends there. And I didn't want to just disappear and leave everything. I had commitments, and I'm glad I went back. I have to say though that when I got on the plane, this is how scary it was at the time. When I was going to the airport with my friend, I sent a text to one of my Japanese friends who had organized a goodbye night for me at the jazz club with people coming. And I emailed them or texted them and thanked her. And the text that she sent back to me said, "If Tokyo is left, we will meet again."
Oh,
That's how scared everybody was.
wow.
But I wanted to go back, and I was relieved actually that I had planned to leave that summer anyway. So that kind of worked out timing wise pretty well. And I was glad that I wasn't teaching because I wouldn't have been able to leave. It was quite an experience. And just last month in October, they have been TEPCO, which is the company that runs the energy systems. They have a new president in Japan. Abe is out, and Suga is the new president. And Suga announced that TEPCO would begin taking all the contaminated water that they have been storing. They're still cooling the reactors and will be for a long, long time with ocean water, but they have to store then the contaminated water that's passed through there. They announced that they were going to start releasing it into the ocean. They announced this last month in October.
That doesn't
And
sound like a very good idea.
no, they have changed their mind since then. They've rescinded that. But the fishermen, there's a big fishing industry in Japan, and they were terrified that their livelihood would be killed. And environmental groups spoke up and protested. So they rescinded that. So I don't know what they're going to do with all that water at that point.
It's radiation, right?
Yeah,
Doesn't that stick around like forever?
yeah.
Because I'm thinking about that because I don't know if you listened to it, but I just did an episode about the Radium Girls.
Oh, yes, I did. Yes.
the hosts of Mystery History podcast I interviewed, Jordan and Allie. I just remembered that was a thing, and so it's like, what happens? What happens to and where are they storing it?
Somewhere on the grounds there. But I do recall hearing that last month and been pretty freaked out that they were going to do that. But then Japanese government does those kinds of things. They announce something and then they say, "Oh no, it's nothing. Don't worry." Well, it's it's
Do you think they
interesting.
do it anyways? Do you think they would
No,
do?
no,
No.
I think that it would be pretty obvious if they did something.
Okay.
It's being monitored. But it's all interesting. So when I went back a year and a half, 2 years later, they still had a blackout schedule. They still had some rules about and guidelines that you don't keep your air conditioning in the summer. In the summer, it's horribly hot and humid. That you don't keep it 70, you keep it at whatever, 90, I don't know, so that it doesn't come on quite that much. I think they have activated a few of the nuclear power plants around the country, but I'd have to check that. I know that when I was there, they were talking about opening one that was on the southern coast, and people were just up in arms. And I joined a protest in downtown Tokyo.
Did you write your sign in Japanese?
No, I didn't do a sign. When I go to these things, I run around with my camera and take pictures of everybody else.
Oh, that's right. Of course you do.
And it was so different from a protest here. They had the police clearing the streets for them and escorting them. And it was quite amazing.
Do they chant?
Yeah, they chanted and they had signs in both Japanese and some in English. No nukes, no nukes. And they had music, they had some bands on trucks. And we went through that, if you've seen pictures of the biggest intersection in the world with all of these zebra striped, the lines, and people are going every which way in this huge intersection. That's Shibuya crossing, and we marched through the Shibuya crossing, and they stopped all the traffic. It was a good thing to be a part of.
When these type of natural disasters happen, there's so many different stories, or any kind of big tragedy that affects a large area with lots of people and communities. There's always that one story that sticks out in your mind. I heard this from people like, my dad he was a cab driver, and when Kennedy was shot, he was driving one of the a politician, an important national politician in Cleveland, and so there was that story.
Right.
Do you have a story like that about this?
Well, I told you my story of where I was, and those are things that when you hear about something or when something happens, you are very much rooted in the place and what was happening at the time. I did kind of compulsively watch a lot of videos about people and their stories. I remember one woman who lived in one of the villages that was destroyed, and she was still living in what looked like a little closet years later because she didn't know where to go. She didn't have family elsewhere. Her family was gone, and she didn't know what to do. You just feel so badly. The guy who went back, I just saw that pretty recently, who went back to his village to take care of the animals, because there were all kinds of animals roaming around. Who knows if they had some harm done to them but by the radiation, but he fed the animals and cared for them and said, this is something he can do. This is where he's always lived. Those are the stories that really touched me, I think.
So when you went back a year later, after you went back for a couple months and finished out your lease and said goodbye to your friends and packed up all your things, and you came back
Right.
home. Did you know that you were going to be going there in a year, or did you just decide you were going back?
Well, I was turning 60 that year. I spent my 50s traveling. I've still done a lot of travels. After I had rented out my house for 8 years, a couple of different families living in the house at different times, and they paid off my mortgage for me. So
Okay.
I could come home, and I gave them a few months' notice. I could come home and I didn't have to work so much. It was a good situation. But I came home and was working on my book and realized that what I really wanted to do was go back and visit the places that I lived and connect with the people there again and see what it was like now. So I went back to Guatemala, and then I was in the Czech Republic for 2 years. So I went back to Prague. Then I wanted to go back to Japan. And the company that I worked for, I taught at universities, but I actually was employed by a company that places you in these jobs. So I thought, that might be the easiest way to go back and visit, is to do it another semester.
When you went back to Japan, did you go back to the same place?
I was
Was
close. I was 2 towns over, or 2 train stops over, and I could walk it in a half an hour. So I could still be in that area and see my friends.
And then you came back to the US and lived in your
Yeah,
house
yeah.
again?
And I'm
And
still
that's when I
here.
met you. And that's when I met
That's
you.
right.
And I was like, who is this woman living in Japan and telling me all these crazy stories about traveling? You are very soft spoken. And every time you tell me a new story like this, I did not understand the extent of this and how you were so immersed in this earthquake and tsunami situation. So I'm always flabbergasted by you. And
Oh, well,
I've
thank
learned a
you.
lot from you. I've learned a lot from you about being independent and about figuring out how to make things happen, being resourceful. And when I moved here, I have that same wanderlust that you do. I mean, it's a different version of it, but I lived in England for 3 months. That was my big
Right, right. No, then
overseas
that's
adventure.
great.
And I was traveling a lot, and then I moved here and I didn't travel for a very long time. And you would always tell me about these new adventures you had coming up. And even though you maybe weren't traveling as much or living for extended periods, you always have the right now is a little different, but you always have
Right, but
an adventure on your horizon, or
right. And I had a couple planned this year, but obviously they're not going to happen. But yeah, I'm always looking for something new and interesting to do. And I volunteered for places like Habitat and volunteer English speaking, couple of volunteer English speaking groups in Europe. And usually I can do a week of something useful and then do some traveling around, and I look for those opportunities. It's good. It's fun.
so is there anything else about the earthquake and tsunami that you haven't talked about that you wanted to?
I did want to mention that when I was worried about the farming area and the fresh foods when I went back that second time, it still hadn't seemed to have changed all that much. So I ended up buying a lot of packaged foods and imported foods, and I had some, native Japanese foods, but they probably laughed at me because they were living there and they had to do what they had to do, but
Yeah.
you kind of do what your comfort level tells you.
Right, right. Do we see this history anywhere in pop culture? Is there a movie? I did just watch a documentary. I think it was Unsolved Mysteries. It's a new
Huh.
version of
Mhm.
it. And I think that's what this one was about. And it's about, and I know you don't believe in this stuff, but I'll keep it
That's all
short.
right.
But it is a documentary, and I'll put the information in the episode notes. And it was about all the paranormal ghost sightings of people
Uh,
who supposedly, it was really interestingly done too. It was different
huh.
that there were all these spirits that didn't realize that they were no longer
Uh,
alive. And
oh,
these
oh, how
stories,
sad. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well, I have one for you, and it is a book that I absolutely love. It's a few years old, and it's called A Tale for the Time Being. and it's by Ruth Ozeki, Ozeki.
Okay.
And obviously she's of Japanese origin, or her family. It's the story of two women. One woman is a Canadian woman living on the west coast of Canada and British Columbia. She finds on the beach a package, and it's a journal wrapped in plastic so it wasn't ruined in the ocean. And
is this a true story?
No.
It's a novel.
No.
Okay.
But it's a novel. But she's reading the journal. So the other part of the story is a young girl in Japan who is writing this journal and her life there. And it's beautiful, and it's so indicative of Japanese culture. There's a little magical realism in it. It's a lovely story, and it is definitely a story about that, because the girl was writing this before, and the woman is finding it after and knew what happened in Japan. Yeah. And there's all this stuff that has washed up, which is, historically true on the Western beaches.
Wow, that's interesting. So that is a fact that there was a lot of things that washed up from the natural disaster in Canada on the West Coast.
Canada and Northern California, I think, as well.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do a little research about what all was found and what kinds of things they were able to realize from some of those artifacts, people who try to escape on boats and things.
I want you to tell our listeners more about you and who you are and the book that you're writing.
All right. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in high school during the Newark race riot, so I can really relate to a lot of the things that people are feeling now in those kinds of racially tense situations. I went to college in the East. I was living in Newark. I was an art student, and I was a half an hour from Manhattan. So I spent a lot of time going into New York City to art museums and galleries and things. That was in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a great time to hang around New York City. And then in my senior year of college, I had a pottery shop in New York State with some friends, some fellow potters. And then I left and traveled around the country and ended up coming to Colorado.
What year was that?
That was 72.
Okay.
And I lived in Denver for almost 20 years. And then I was in my second marriage with a kid and a stepson, and we moved up to the mountains. And I'm in this little town where I met you.
Georgetown, Colorado.
Right, Georgetown, Colorado. Charming little town, but it's close enough to Denver to still get a city fix once in a while.
Right.
Not really during the pandemic, but.
I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
No, it's a good place to be, and it's a wonderful community. So I've been involved in a lot of voluntary stuff.
So you were married, you had a son.
Yeah, my husband died.
Your husband died. Okay, cancer. George.
Yeah.
And he was young.
He was 51. I was 45 at the time.
You've told me this before, so that must have been very devastating. But you always have said that he was the love of your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a first marriage, and we were good friends, but it wasn't the same. And we drifted apart after a while. And
so he was the father, George, who passed away of cancer in the 90s. He was the father of your son.
My son, Adam. Mm-hmm.
And Adam was how old when he passed away?
Adam was 12.
Okay.
Once Adam went to college, I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself? My job situation.
Wait. You need to back up. Because I want you to tell your whole story that I know. So what was one of the things that you and your son did? How did you connect with your son? You know what I'm trying to say. So what did you guys do?
Well, it was just the two of us. It was an interesting time because he was an adolescent. He was a preteen. And this is the time of life that you start arguing with your parents and you don't want to be around them and stuff. But we bonded. We played games at night, we watched movies, we went and we started traveling. I took him and we started taking trips, first to visit people we knew and then to just explore different places, to Europe and Costa Rica. We just did some different travels, and he loved the traveling. He's often come and traveled with me in various places in his adult
Well,
life.
since I've known you, you've gone on quite a few trips with your adult son.
Yes.
So that is an unusual story, especially for an adolescent
Yeah,
to
yeah.
bond in that way. And so what were some of the trips that you guys went on overseas?
Oh, we did a backpacking trip. No, we did Spain and Italy. We did take a train through southern France and stop at Nice. We did some time doing that. We have since done Iceland, Ireland, Mediterranean.
You have
We
this
did a
look
trip.
on your face like you're talking about what you ate for dinner or something. I'm just telling you from my point of view, that is so amazing and that you were able to give him that.
You know, we relate as adults. I've never treated him like a little kid. You know, I
What a
think.
world you opened up to him. I mean, I could not imagine having such, a cool mom that just like looked at the world the way you did and took me to all these places. That was a beautiful thing that you did with your son.
Well, you know, these things never would have happened if we hadn't had the earlier tragedies. My
Yeah.
parents died soon after my husband, oddly enough, and suddenly I didn't have anything to keep me. So I thought, I've always wanted to travel. Let's go explore the world.
Yeah. Well, see, a lot of people would have thought otherwise. Well, I do. I have this son, so I can't travel. But you didn't let that be an obstacle. You looked at it as an opportunity, and it
Right,
was.
right.
You are an exceptional person because I don't know anybody who's ever done the things that you've done in the ways that you've done them. Then after Adam went away to school, you continued traveling. You found bigger, longer opportunities because of course you probably couldn't do a lot of that before because he was in school.
Right. And like I said, my job situation was changing and I needed to change. I needed to do something different. I knew I needed a new challenge in my life and it was a new episode.
When did you actually start writing the book about your traveling,
Oh, that's a good
your
question. I'm
memoir?
glad you asked that. I journaled pretty extensively while I was living in those countries. And right off the bat, I decided I had a website. You know, I had been a computer geek. I had a website and I started posting photos and stories. And I realized this was a great way to keep in touch with people because my friends back home would comment and otherwise I wouldn't hear from them, and I did that through the whole time. My journaling was often included more personal stories about people that I didn't post. I just posted the travel stories. So I just recently started a new website last fall and blog. I'm pulling up some of those older stories.
So you have an amazing blog. What's it called?
I guess it's called Musings from the Colorado Mountains because that's where I'm coming from now. I've always used RR on the road, so that's kind of my handle. It's always an interest
So
of
how would
mine.
you describe what you write about?
Well, I suppose you could call it a travel memoir, but it's much more in depth than most travelers that just breeze through a place and meet a person or two. But I've stayed there long enough to make friendships and learn about the culture. And really, in each place, in each of the three countries, I became more and more involved with the people and the culture. It's much more in depth than travel stories that you generally find.
Do you have a title?
Yes, it's Go Wherever You Want. When I told my son what I was going to be doing, I was going to this job fair to find an international teaching job. I took him out to dinner and I told him all this. And he was in college, but he wasn't that far away. He wasn't living at home anymore. He thought about it and he said, Go wherever you want. just send me a ticket. So that's where the title comes from.
Did he come and visit you when you lived in Japan?
He came to each place. He's the only person who came to visit me in each place, so he has an understanding of what my life was in each of those, and some of the people that I was friends with and came exploring with me around the
Oh,
countries.
that's nice. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, I guess one of the things I want to know is why did you pick the history you picked, and what is it that you want people to know about that? Like, what's the most important thing about that history that you want them to know?
Well, I have to say that I'm not much of an amateur historian. I'm not someone who reads a lot of historical novels and has a lot of knowledge about different times in history. This was something that I experienced, so it's something that I know about and I can talk about. I think, when disasters like this, when natural disasters like this happen, in Guatemala, they would have mudslides sometimes and they just had one that wipes out villages, and horrible things happen and people need help and it upends everything, and we all go through our normal lives and say, oh gee, that's too bad. But when you come into contact with it, it touches you in a way that it's hard to imagine other people can understand. But Japanese are resilient people, and for the most part they've done quite well to leave it behind.
It's still a part of who they are now.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's part of
because
who they are.
everybody has a story about that event. Everybody was touched by it.
Right. And there's a sorrow that they live with. There's a grief that they live
Yeah.
with when you go through anything, whether it's a personal tragedy or, we've got fires here in Colorado and people who are displaced, whose houses burned or at least had to evacuate for a while, and things happen all over the place. It becomes part of who you are and your
Right.
understanding of other people who are going
Well,
through
and in a
things.
way, it's become a part of who you are, that experience.
That's true. That's true. And I do think about it.
Yeah.
I think we touched on a lot.
What is, okay, your website?
Oh, it's ruthrosenfeld.com.
RuthRosenfeld.com. Okay, I'll put a link in the episode notes.
Yeah, and the blog is one of the menu choices.
And the
That's what I
book
do.
is, we're not sure when that's coming out, but
The book is done. I am hoping, I'm reluctant to self-publish. I would like to find a publisher to pick it up. So I am in the process of seeking an agent. We'll see how that goes.
well,
It
if you're a
might.
traveler and you love to travel, you can't travel now, check out RuthRosenfeld.com. Read her blog because you'll feel like you're there. She's a brilliant writer. So,
Okay.
Ruth, it was so great talking to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Anne Marie. This has been a lot of fun to talk about. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
There you have it. That was Ruth Rosenfeld. To find out more about Ruth and about the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great week.